What's going on, guys? Welcome in. Krishna Gamer, can you please look at Roku? Should I hold or dump my RSUs? Alright, I'll take a look at Roku for you. We'll see what's going on. I heard pretty much, I think it was Tom that was mentioning, there was like a really deep in the money put that came through, and I think it was like $700 or something in the money. That was insanely crazy. But I'll take a look at it. We'll see what's going on with Roku here. But it was a hell of a day. What a recovery that we ended up having today. And I pretty much ended up having a zone. Those of you that saw in the dojo, I pretty much had a zone in which I was looking to potentially buy the dip. I know that Avery came into the chat there as well, even though I believe he's still traveling home. He hasn't been with us for the few days. I know that he was pretty much preaching also about pretty much buying the dip. And that's exactly what ended up happening. It ended up potentially being a buy the dip type of opportunity. We sank. We could basically see a nice little descending channeling action here that pretty much starts off for the past, 3-4 days that we've already had since August 26th. And you could basically see the descending channeling action as we continue to just melt right into that support. And we started to see some accumulation start at the bottom here. And then that was just a phenomenal move. You can see the little bit of a higher node here as we were pretty much trying to pretty much do waterfall into the morning basically. We had a nice little high volume node. We started to see a little bit of accumulation. Once we got over that little high volume node there was nothing but thin air, and that's why we saw that sporadic recovery that literally just felt like it kind of went parabolic. So that was a beautiful move that we ended up having. That was a lot of oversold territory, and it's pretty much going into a sign that we're going to start basically a new month. This is starting a new month, starting September, which is roughly usually bearish. So that's the biggest takeaway, is knowing that September is typically bearish, and this was just a sign of pretty much recovering as the bearish month is going to be starting. This was pretty much a nice way of pairing our losses right now, starting the new month. So that was just a sporadic recovery. That was a beautiful parabolic move. We do have some potential more upside. As you see, there's another higher volume node up here towards 39.88 as we're looking off futes. Going right into that downtrend resistance, you're pretty much flirting right around that 4,000 mark on ES, which is going to be that mental number. We ended up cracking below that number. You saw pretty much the amount of chop that we've had. Ended up acting as support to resistance for quite a while before we ultimately broke that 4,000 level on ES. I expect to pretty much end up testing this 4,000 level, potentially more than likely as a resistance. And I don't think that bulls are pretty much out of the water just yet. I do believe that there is going to be another strong leg to the downside here as well going into September as we just started. So I wouldn't get too happy just yet, but it does seem like a sigh of relief that we should have a little bit more of a continuation, at least a gap up on the back end of this phenomenal recovery we had today, and we should see that gap up or continuation going into tomorrow. Now next week that seems like a whole entirely different story. Let's see if we end up holding, if we get this continuation of this move towards ESI 4000 and how we particularly hold, or if we get continuation above that mental key number right there. Right? So that's the biggest takeaway to me right now. I want to see once we get to that 4,000 how we end up reacting, and then that'll likely determine more so how we approach going into next week. All right. So that's pretty much with that. Otherwise, as far down as in terms of retracement that we can see, if we do see a strong retracement off of this, then we could end up retracing right back down towards 39.45 is what I'm looking at tomorrow morning before we get the continuation towards that 4,000 mark. So that would be pretty much assuming that we get maybe a buy the dip type of opportunity, and that'll be our dip and rip. All right. So other than that, I think just a few names that kind of stood out. We also saw what ended up happening with Nvidia. That was just a disappointment that ended up happening. I think yesterday afternoon we saw it down about like $9 after hours. You also see that, I mean, even though it kind of participated in the recovery, that was just a slaughter that it ended up taking part on. But you can also see that you are sitting at a little bit of a higher volume node here at this 139 mark, but above that 139, there's nothing but thin air towards that gap fill, and that's what I'll be looking at tomorrow to see in the process of this recovery, how does Nvidia look along with the semis in terms of recovery? Do they end up picking up the slack in terms of how major mega cap tech names actually moved pretty swiftly today? And let's see how the semis are actually end up recovering, as they didn't do as well as your tech names overall. So I'm going to look at that one. If we can get that push over 140 half, I'm going to be looking towards that gap fill that's sitting right around that 143. 143 half, and then I doubt that we end up getting into that gap fill, but that'll be a hell of a gap and a hell of a squeeze if we can end up getting that tomorrow. So I'll pay attention to the video tomorrow. AMD is another one. That's pretty much when that was on my radar. I actually have a good chance of feeling that we're gonna fill the AMD gap more so than the Nvidia gap. I do think that we can get this push. Looking at a little bit of resistance right around this 84 mark, but above 84, you're looking at 85.19. And if semis really do participate in this recovery tomorrow, this can push up towards 86.48 rather easily. So I do like that one as well. We had basically a cloud alert that went off on Netflix. I know that Avery mentioned it earlier on in the morning, basically. That was a beautiful move. Once we ended up hitting that cloud alert, I think the target was like 228 and a half. And I think it triggered roughly around the 225-ish mark, if I remember off memory. So that was a beautiful one. I think that was literally right smack once we started to get that swift recovery. That was literally just a buy and forget as the rest of the market started to recover. So beautiful move off of that one. I do expect continuation on this one. You have a little bit of resistance sitting right around this 232 mark. I would anticipate that we likely, if we get a dip and rip, or we end up gapping up to that resistance, I expect us to not necessarily blow through that resistance on the first attempt. So 232 is going to be a level to watch, but above that, I have this pushing up towards 237, and that'll likely be right smack into the middle of this gap fill. That if we do get solid continuation with the broader market, we can see this make a stronger push towards 240. And I really do like this one because that's about a near $10 upside from current levels. So that'll be a beautiful one. The only thing to be cautious about is if you're playing a 0 day and hoping for a $10 move on this tomorrow. If we get a dip and rip type of scenario, be cautious about that. All right. So I do like this one a lot actually. So Netflix is pretty high on my watch list here tomorrow, along with AMD. Those are probably going to be more so two of my favorites. I will be paying attention to Apple more so than maybe looking at a Microsoft. Not necessarily Microsoft, but looking at Tesla. I do like Apple here a lot to pretty much give us a nice little jolt in terms of this recovery continuing. So I do like this one. Looking at some resistance here right around this 159 flat is what I'm looking at. But above that 159 flat, I do think that we could see Apple stretch up towards 162 is what I like about this one. So that'll be a beautiful one. What I would preferably like to see is if we can get a retracement right back down towards 157.23 that is, and then we can get that dip and rip type of scenario. Or in fact, maybe we end up getting a little bit of an inverted head and shoulders type of action. If you actually see if I kind of outline it, you kind of get a little bit of a head and shoulders type of action, which if we do get that little dip and rip scenario, that will play out perfectly up towards that 162 target that I'm looking at. So that's a beautiful one as well. In terms of tech, outside of that, there's not too much else that maybe I want to say I'm focused on. I wonder if the Amazon gap filled. Did it actually fill off of the daily? Take the peep on the daily. I mean we're pretty much almost near that gap fill. So that's why I do think there's another leg down. This is not necessarily one that I particularly see a lot of strength out of. You do have quite the overhead resistance sitting around that 128.67 mark. So that's one that I'm a little bit more skeptic on as far as the upside on Amazon. But this is one that's still going to be viable more than likely. But I will look to see if we get a dip opportunity. The dip opportunity I would be looking at is roughly around 126.37 is what I'm looking at. All right. Krishna, let me get to your Roku name that you actually just mentioned. Let's see what's going on with Roku real quick, and I'll take a peep at that for you. This is a hell of a chart. One thing is pretty much obviously you still have a well-defined downtrend. There's not too much that says that you have a lot of upside. Now, in terms of this, I would say that if you do not see that Roku can pretty much get over that $70 mark, I think that's when I'm gonna likely end up considering say the fact that you should end up cutting that loss if you are in a loss right now, because $70 seems to be a pretty much a heavy overhead supply, and you can also see the volume node right there that you're likely going to be pushing into at that $70 level. So if you can't get above the $70 level, you're going to pretty much struggle, and you're likely going to end up retesting right back down towards 66. And I would hate to see you pretty much end up retesting 66, and I'm sure that's going to likely end up just killing your premiums. So watch for the 70 test tomorrow morning. If you get the push, you get a broader market gap up. Watch for that push. Otherwise, in terms of the dip buy scenario, per se, or a level you want to see it hold, you want to see this hold above 67.38 is where you're looking to pretty much ideally hold. All right, but over that 70 level, if we can get the push over 70 here, I think you can get a pretty strong and swift move up towards 72 half is what I'm looking at. But I think you're a little bit more pressed on some heavy overhead supply. That's likely not going to give you the upside that you're potentially looking at, and that's just depending what you're holding rather. All right. So 70 up towards 72 half, those are pretty much your two key levels. Otherwise, then again, like I said, you're looking towards the downside here. Look to see if you can hold roughly around that 67 low. All right. Again, though, pretty much today was a beautiful recovery. I think this is what the Bulls really wanted in terms of getting some kind of sigh of relief. Hopefully, those that pretty much have losses, you were able to pretty much pare those losses. But biggest thing is that let's see how we get continuation tomorrow. That's the biggest factor. Do I think it's going to end up holding out and continuing into next week? I'll be honest with you, I don't think it does. I do think we just kind of pair these losses going into the end of the week. We'll likely hear the headline saying market pairs losses, but pretty much finishes on the downside as the bearish month of September pretty much has started. So I think that's pretty much what I would say right now. Not much else that's really on my radar. Let's see what the market gives us tomorrow. And ideally, I would hope for that dip and rip type of scenario tomorrow where we literally just had a nice strong rip into power hour. But I think what the market needs to settle this, give us a nice little pullback in the morning, and then we could pretty much get a beautiful push towards having a beautiful 0 day Friday. All right. On that though, I will leave it as is, and you guys all have a great evening. I will see you guys tomorrow.